Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular Halacha shir. Our topic this evening is the length of the synagogue services. And before we get into the sources dealing with this issue, let me make an introductory comment. If you want to ask a question during the class, feel free to type your question on chat. I will see your question on my screen, of course, and then I will be able to incorporate the answer to your question in the ongoing shiur. Now, the basic structure, the organization of the material is basically going to be along the following pattern. First, we're going to begin looking at the attitudes of the great rabbis through the generations to long prayers and short prayers. And although the rabbis have not had a lot to say about the value of longer prayers or the value of shortening prayers, there are some significant ideas, attitudes which they had, and then we're going to survey them. On that basis, we're then going to turn to the halachic sources, exactly what is required, what is optional, what can be left out, what has to be included in. We'll see the halachic details afterwards. Let's begin looking at the sources. I don't know how to do this. I click over here. Okay. Now, I'm not going to bother telling you where I draw the sources from, because you have the sources exactly on the screen, a chapter and verse where I'm taking these things from. So if you want to look up the sources and see what mistakes I've made, I'm not a great typist, and feel free to check out the sources yourself. You have them exactly on the screen. What it says in the verse, in the Torah, happens to be from Sefer Mishlei. What it says is, "Hoka raglachama beis reyecha," don't overstay your welcome in your friend's house. Of course, it's nice to visit your friend, but don't overstay your visit. Pen yizbechu u'sneyecha, lest he have enough of you and he come to hate you. That's what happens when you overstay your visit. Well, the idea is fairly simple and straightforward, but let's see the attitudes of the great rabbis and what we can learn about their attitudes from this verse. The Gra, the Gaon Mevilna, hard to point to a more influential authority in the history of rabbinic thought than the Gra. The Gaon Mevilna, early 18th century Lithuania. He comments on this verse. He wrote a whole commentary on the book of Proverbs on Sefer Mishlei, and this is extracted from that commentary on the verse at hand. Don't overstay your visit in your friend's house, is what the verse says. The comment of the Gra, the comment of the Gaon Mevilna is as follows. Isn't it sort of obvious, he thinks, that you shouldn't overstay your visit? We really need Shlomo HaMelech, we really need King Solomon to teach us this important idea that you shouldn't overstay your visit. Isn't it sort of obvious? Shouldn't everyone be able to figure that out himself? Shouldn't everyone be able to figure that out herself? Well, but there's an inner meaning, not the simple, straightforward chat, not the simple, straightforward meaning of the verse, but a hint to another idea which teaches us a lot about the Gra's attitude towards prayers in the synagogue. Don't overstay your visit in your friend's house. Well, what is being referred to by your friend's house? Elu bate knesset. What is your friend's house? Your friend is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, your friend is God, his house is the synagogue, and the Gra knew full well the difference between pshat, the simple, straightforward meaning, and drashot such as these, but this is the way he darshans the verse. This is his midrashic understanding of the verse. The verse is coming to teach us, don't overstay your welcome in the synagogue. Hainu, namely, al yarbe adam b'tfilah, one should not lengthen one's prayers, yoter b'shalosh sha'ot, more than 3 hours. 3 hours is maximum tops that you should be praying in the synagogue. More than that is overstaying your visit. Now, this is not the forum in which we would discuss the relationship between simple meaning of the verse and the midrashic understanding of the verse in the thinking of the Gra. In order to analyze that question, we would have to go through a lot of comments of the Gra, a lot of his commentary on different verses. But one point is perfectly clear, namely, according to the Gra, the amount of time that you should spend in the synagogue has a maximum, a ceiling, and no one should be praying there for more than 3 hours. If after the prayers you hang around and you have kiddush, if after the prayers you hang around in the synagogue and have a shiur, you do other things, that's okay. It's the lengthening of the prayers beyond 3 hours, which is objectionable according to the Gra, according to the Gaon of Vilna. And some of the disciples of the Gra made their way to Eretz Yisrael. The first Ashkenaz community in Eretz Yisrael consisted of disciples of the Gra, and therefore Minhag Ashkenaz here in Eretz Yisrael is largely the minhag of the Gra. There are tons of examples. Yeah, we're going to get to the sources for the 3 hours in a moment. The many examples of minhagim, which are commonly observed in the synagogues in Eretz Yisrael, Ashkenaz synagogues, which have their origin in the thinking of the Gra, have their origin in the thinking of the Gaon of Vilna. Unlike Ashkenaz synagogues outside of Israel, where the influence of the Gra was minimal as far as minhagim are concerned. After all, the German Jews, the Polish Jews, the Hungarian Jews, all of the different sub-communities within the Ashkenaz world had their minhagim clearly in place long before the days of the Gra, and they did not give them up. But in Eretz Yisrael, where the Ashkenaz community was founded by the disciples of the Gra, here in Eretz Yisrael, the minhagim of the Gra are largely definitive. For example, and there's so many examples, that the Gra held that every Shabbat and every Yom Tov, when it comes time to read the Haftarah, the prophetic reading after Kriyas HaTorah, according to the Gra, the prophetic reading, the Haftarah, must always be read from a scroll, a parchment scroll, written by a scribe in the kosher way, exactly the same way that a Sefer Torah is written. And here in Eretz Yisrael, in the overwhelming majority of Ashkenaz synagogues, that indeed is still the practice. Well, I didn't do a survey and count up the different shuls to see what they do, but surely in my neighborhood and in other neighborhoods where I have lived, that's exactly what the Ashkenaz synagogues do. When all this began, when the Ashkenaz community in Eretz Yisrael got on its feet, and all of this came into play, one of the great rabbis, Rav Zevin, was unhappy with this particular phenomenon, with this embracing of the minhagim of the Gra, because he pointed out that even in Lithuania, most people were not following the minhag of the Gra. Indeed, in Vilna itself, the only synagogue in which his minhagim, in which the minhagim and the Gra were being followed, was the synagogue in which he actually davened himself. So it was a minority practice in Ashkenaz communities in Europe, limited to one synagogue where the Gra himself davened. So Rav Zevin was not happy about its general adoption in Eretz Israel, but historically that's what happens. And we're going to see later when we come to the halachic discourse whether or not we're stuck with that or whether there's some room for changing minhagim. Let's go one step further. There's another verse in the Torah. Says in the Torah that when Moshe Rabbeinu held up his hands, Gavar Yisrael, the Jewish army would prevail. V'kasher yaniach yado Gavar Amalek, and when Moshe Rabbeinu put his arms down, then the Amalekites would prevail. There was a war between the Amalekites and the Bnei Israel on the way from Egypt to Eretz Israel. Everyone knows about that. And Moshe Rabbeinu was observing the battlefield from the top of a hill. When his arms were up, the Jews won. When his arms went down, the Amalek Amalek got the upper hands. Now, the Chazal in the Mishnah understand this in the following way. Chazal in the Mishnah ask a very simple, straightforward question. Do the arms of Moshe Rabbeinu wage war? How on earth, is there some kind of magic when Moshe Rabbeinu raises his arms and the Jewish forces prevail on the battlefield? What on earth is the connection between Moshe Rabbeinu raising his arms and the Jews prevailing on the battlefield? Well, the Mishnah has a simple, straightforward answer. When Moshe Rabbeinu would raise his arms, the Jewish forces notice that on the battlefield. They would raise their eyes to Avinu Shebashamayim. They would turn their thoughts to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to the sublime, and as long as their kavanah, as long as their intentions were pure, they would prevail. When Moshe Rabbeinu got tired and he lowered his hands, all of a sudden the Jews were distracted from the purity of their thought, from the kavanahs which they had, and they began to lose on the battlefield. The Ramban, in his commentary on this verse, Ramban, 13th century Spain, after the Reconquista in the Christian period, Kasher yaniach yado, when Moshe Rabbeinu would lower his hands, al derech pshat, Ramban knew the difference between the simple, straightforward meaning of the verse and a midrashic understanding. As far as the pshat is concerned, the straightforward, literal meaning of the verse, as far as that's concerned, kasher hiniach yado ba'oneth mipnei koved yadav, when he just got too tired and he didn't have enough strength to keep his arms up, Ra'ah shegavar Amalek, he noticed that Amalek would prevail. Tziva la'Aharon v'Hur, he therefore instructed Aharon and Hur, each of them to stand on one side, and he instructed each of them to hold up one hand, so that both his hands would be held on high, sheyitmechu bahem v'lo yanichu bod, that he should have some help in holding up his hands so he wouldn't get so tired. Okay, that's the simple, straightforward understanding of the meaning of the verse. The Rabboteinu and our great rabbis, these are still the words of the Ramban, our great rabbis, Amru b'Midrash, said in the Midrash as follows. And he's about to quote a Midrash on this verse, which gives a midrashic understanding. And the Midrash he's about to quote is from the Sefer HaBahir. Now, the Sefer HaBahir is not what most people call a Midrash. What most people call a Midrash is the Midrash Rabbah, the Tanchuma. There's a whole body of Midrashic literature which is normally called midrash. This particular sefer does not belong to the category of literature which is normally called midrash. This sefer is a hardcore Kabbalistic work. Back in the High Middle Ages, back in the days of the Ramban, this book was attributed to the Tanaim, to the great rabbis of the Mishnaic period. Historians have different opinions. The authorship is not 100% clear here, but it is a hardcore Kabbalistic work, which is a distinct genre, a distinct body of literature separate from Midrash. Nonetheless, the Ramban quotes it here. We're about to get the quotation, and he calls it a Midrash. The Ramban was, among other things, one of the great mystics, one of the great Kabbalists of the medieval period. And his commentary on the Torah, which we have on the screen an example, but his commentary on the Torah was one of the most important guides to Kabbalistic thought in the Middle Ages. Over and over again, the Ramban explains things Kabbalistically, and we're about to get a Kabbalistic understanding of the verse. Let's see what the so-called Midrash, what the Sefer HaBahir, let us see what the Kabbalistic the mystical understanding of the verse is. V'chi Moshe haya oseh sheyigbar Amalek alav. The Moshe Rabbeinu's hands cause the Jews to prevail or the Amalekites to prevail? Well, we know the answer to that question in the Mishnah. It all had to do with whether or not the Jewish forces were inspired to rely upon Avinu Shebashamayim, upon God in heaven. That's the answer of the Mishnah. But the Sefer HaBahir, the Kabbalistic understanding, is different. Ella, rather. Asur la'adam lishhot shalosh sha'ot kapav prusot l'shamayim. Whenever engaged in prayer, and Moshe Rabbeinu was surely praying for a Jewish victory on the battlefield in the war between Bnei Yisrael and Amalek. Moshe Rabbeinu was surely praying for Jewish victory, and prayer should never last more than 3 hours. Moshe Rabbeinu kept his arms extended for a maximum length prayer, 3 hours, and then he had to lower his arms. Well, of course, this is not the pshat, the simple, straightforward meaning of the verse, but this is the way the Kabbalists explained it. This gives us a Kabbalistic dimension of understanding what is going on. And the bottom line is prayer should be limited to 3 hours tops. Moshe Rabbeinu, who was greater than Moshe Rabbeinu, would not pray for more than 3 hours, even though the Jews were in the midst of a battle on the battlefield and surely needed divine assistance every moment. But it's just wrong to daven, to pray for more than 3 hours at a time. Well, we see here that the Kabbalistic idea, which the Ramban is presenting us, is clearly the source of the practice of the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna on the previous screen. When the Gra, the Gaon Vilna on the previous screen said, don't pray for more than 3 hours in the synagogue, that's overstaying your visit with God, that's overstaying your visit in the synagogue if you pray for more than 3 hours. And we see clearly where he got that idea from. It's a Kabbalistic idea which comes straight from the Sefer HaBahir, one of the, and that Sefer is, it's earlier than the Zohar, but it's not as important as the Zohar, but right up there together with the Zohar as an important source of Kabbalistic thought. Okay, the Gra said, ceiling of 3 hours in prayer. The Ramban agrees. Well, historically the other way around. The Gra agrees with the Ramban, and the whole idea is of a Kabbalistic nature. Next, Rav Menachem Azaria, Rav Menachem Azaria from Fano in Italy. He's from the 16th century in Italy, and back in the 16th century, he was the big name. He was a heavyweight, not only in halacha. His shuvot, his halachic writings, were immensely influential in subsequent generations, but he was also one of the great Kabbalists of the 16th century. It's unusual to have a single authority, a single great mind in both worlds, the halachic world and the Kabbalistic world. The Ramban combined both, and Rav Menachem Azaria from Fano in Italy, he combined both. The Gra as well was a gadol, was great, both in the world of Kabbalah and in the world of halacha. In any event, here we are in the 16th century. Rav Menachem Azaria from Fano, he wrote the Sefer Asara Ma'amarot, again, a hardcore Kabbalistic work, just as his halachic works were immensely influential. Similarly, his Kabbalistic works were immensely influential in Kabbalistic circles. Well, he too is aware of what it says in the Sefer HaBahir about not praying for more than 3 hours. Asur la'amod b'nesiyas kapayim. You're not allowed to hold your hands on high in prayer. Yoter b'shalosh sha'ot, more than 3 hours. Hakavana, the whole idea here, he explains, what's wrong with praying for more than 3 hours? Why did Moshe Rabbeinu limit his prayers to a maximum of 3 hours? Why, a couple centuries later, is the Gra going to say, don't daven more than 3 hours? What's wrong with davening more than 3 hours? Well, the idea is, shelo lahatriach klape mala, not to make a nuisance of yourself with God. After all, that's what it said in the verse that we began with today. Don't overstay your visit in your friend's house. Your friend is happy to have you visit, but there's a limit, you know. How long are you planning to sleep over in my house? There's a limit to how long the welcome can be. And who is your friend in whose house you are visiting? Well, that's the synagogue, that's the Beit Knesset when you're praying with God. So as not to make a nuisance of yourself, so as not to bother God unnecessarily, you have a 3 hour maximum to pray. Kedei shalosh brachot, yivarechecha, Yair, and Yisa. That's why the Kohanim have only 3 blessings which they recite. Why are the Kohanim limited to only 3 blessings when they bless the people? And incidentally, a Kohen who adds an extra bracha, the Kohanim are absolutely limited to 3 brachot. A Kohen who would add an extra bracha or 2, any number of extra brachas, would be guilty of violating the commandment of the Torah, lo tasif. There are 613 commandments, and anyone who adds to a commandment is guilty of violating the Torah prohibition of lo tasif, the prohibition of not adding to the mitzvahs. Well, 3 is the key here. 3 is the maximum number. Bracha, V'shah achat la'Avraham, Shniya liYitzchak, Shlishit liYaakov. The 3 hours, the maximum of 3 hours that you can spend in prayer, are Kabbalistically related to the characteristics of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. In another series of shiurim, we could talk about the way the Kabbalists understood the characteristics of the three great patriarchs, and that would dictate the nature of the prayer. In the first hour, the nature of the prayer in the second hour, the nature of the prayer in the third hour, but the whole idea of limiting prayer to 3 hours tops, that is so as not to bother God too much, so as not to make a nuisance of yourself. And then he asks, these are still the words of Menachem Azariah in the 16th century, Kol kach lama? What do you mean you don't want to bother God? God can't handle a little bit more prayer. Somehow God is going to reject you if you have too much thanks or too much praise or too many bakashot or something. Well, God's going to God can be bothered by your prayer. Well, what on earth is that supposed to mean? He asks. Mipnei sheritzono le'ashpia. It is the nature of God, and this too is a Kabbalistic idea. It is the nature of God to do good. It is the nature of God to want to shower goodness upon mankind. God wants to mashpia, wants to cause goodness to flow from the upper worlds to us. That's what God wants to do. Kabbalistically, it's our job to build the kalim, to build the utensils, the vessels which will hold the goodness when it comes down to us. But God, that's what God wants to do. He wants to send down goodness from the upper worlds to us. Ve'ein adam mekabel b'zman shu mashpia. And doesn't work two directions at the same time. During the period of time that you are sending up your prayers, well, during that period of time, while you are sending up your prayers, so the good is not going to descend. The pipeline can only hold motion in one direction at a time. If you daven too much, so your prayers are going to go up, but if your prayers are going up, that meanwhile is stopping the goodness from coming down. Well, here we have a clear Kabbalist, well, as clear as anything Kabbalistic can be. We have a clear understanding of the way the Kabbalists want to limit prayer to 3 hours. We understand why they want to limit the prayer to 3 hours, because God wants to send down good, and he has to wait for you to stop praying to do that. And therefore, you don't want to pray too long. Bottom line, we have source after source after source, which rooted in Kabbalistic attitudes, rooted in Kabbalistic thinking, put a cap, put a maximum on tefillah. Let's go one step further here. Voila. Kilot Yaakov. The sefer we're about to quote from is and as in all of my shiurim, I limit the sources that I present to you to only the most important primary sources. There are tons of sources out there by more obscure rabbis, which are very interesting. There are tons of sources out there of which never had much impact on rabbinic thought, which happen to be very interesting ideas, as interesting as the ideas might be. In my shiurim, I try to focus on the ideas which were widely embraced, the ideas which had great influence on rabbinic thinking through the generations. Well, Kilot Yaakov was also was an important author. The family name is Yulis, Rav Yulis. But as with so many great rabbis, the family name is not well known in the yeshiva world. He's known just by the name of his svarim, and he's generally just called the Kilas Yaakov, or another famous book he wrote was the Melo HaRo'im. It's generally just called the Melo HaRo'im, or the Kilas Yaakov. Talk about Rav Yulis in the 19th century. He was a 19th century Kabbalist. talk about Rav Yulis, most people will not know who you are talking about. Talk about the Sefer Kilas Yaakov or another Sefer he wrote, the Maloa Rowan. He was an important, influential writer. Let's see what he says. He begins by quoting the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Hasidim Rishonim, the pious rabbis of earlier generations, when the Mishnah talks about the pious rabbis of the earlier generations, we're talking about a long time ago, right? The pre-Mishnaic pious rabbis, Hayut Shohim Sha'achat, they would wait for 1 hour before praying. That is, when it came time to pray, Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv, whatever it is, they would not come into the synagogue and just start prayer right away. They would first meditate for an hour in order to have in order to clear their minds of everything having to do with the mundane, secular world we live in. And after having prepared their minds, clearing their minds to be able to focus on the holy, to be able to focus on the prayer, after an hour, they would start praying. It took them an hour to work up the proper concentration to be able to pray. Only after an hour of effort did they have the kavanah necessary for prayer. They waited an hour before prayer. The Mishnah teaches us that their prayer lasted for 1 hour. And after their prayer, they needed a cool-off session for another full hour in order to cool off after the prayer, in order to be able to return to mundane activities outside of the synagogue. The sha'achat acharat tefillah, the 1 hour cool down period after prayers, kidei lahashhot muchim l'zachar u'nekeva shelo yisalku ad sha'achat acharat tefillah. The whole Kabbalistic thrust of the 1 hour prayer is to unify God in the upper worlds, and the impact on yourself of that unification of God in the upper worlds lasts for a full hour after you finish prayer. And therefore, you want to sit quietly and meditate for an hour after prayer. Okay, those are the Hasidim Rishonim. Those are the pious rabbis of early generations. An hour work up before prayer, an hour of prayer, an hour of cool down time after prayer, in order to return to mundane activities. The Chazal and the Mishnah, then, of course, were very interested in the following question. The whole process takes 3 hours: an hour of preparation, an hour of prayer, an hour afterwards. The whole thing takes 3 hours. Shacharis, Mincha, Ma'ariv, there's 9 hours right there in the day just devoted to prayer. The Mishnah is, of course, very interested in the question is, when did they have time to do anything else? When did they have time to learn Tosafos? When did they have time to learn Shulchan Aruch? I mean, when did they have time to learn Torah? 9 hours a day, every day, devoted to prayer, and what surrounds prayer before and after is an awful lot. That's what the Mishnah is interested in. The Kabbalists say, Nimtza, it turns out, Shahayu Mishtamrim b'mochin elu shalosh. It turns out that their engagement with the holy, it turns out that their engagement with the Shekhinah, the divine presence, that's what prayer is all about, engaging with God. The entire process of engaging with God was 3 hours. 3 hours before, 3 hours in active prayer, and an hour in preparation, an hour in active prayer, and an hour afterwards. Yater mishalosh shavot, more than 3 hours. The effort the mental effort required for the unification of God in the upper spheres, the mental energy required for prayer, no one, not even the greatest rabbis of the earlier generations, not even the Hasidim Rishonim from the earliest generations of rabbis, no one has enough mental energy to devote more than 3 hours to prayer. The Hasidim Rishonim, the Mishnah, is concerned with what they didn't have time for anything else in the course of the day. The Kabbalists look at things a little bit different. The Hasidim Rishonim surely would have spent more time in prayer if they could. Why did they not devote more time to prayer? Because no one, not even the greatest chassid, not even the greatest pious, not even the greatest pious rabbi of the earlier generations, no one has the mental strength, no one has the mental capacity to direct his or her thoughts to the divine, to engage with the divine for more than 3 hours. Afilu Moshe Rabbeinu, even Moshe Rabbeinu, who was surely the greatest of all time rabbis, couldn't hold his arms up, could not engage with God for more than 3 hours at a time. Well, if the greatest of the mitpalalim, if the greatest of rabbis could not engage, did not have the energy, did not have the strength, did not have the ability to engage with the holy for more than 3 hours, we surely cannot. And therefore, this idea of the 3-hour limit is firmly in place. And it's all rooted in the Kabbalistic understanding, which was given to us originally in the Sefer HaBahir. Well, let's leave the historians to argue about whether or not that Sefer is really of Tanaitic origin from the period of Mishnah or from some subsequent period, but that's surely where the ideas come from. And if you think about it, the ideas are reasonable. There's some sense to the ideas. After all, anyone who takes prayer seriously, anyone who takes the engagement with God seriously, anyone who seriously views himself, anyone who seriously views herself as standing in divine presence, the Shekhinah, that requires a mental effort, and there's a limit to how long humans are able to do that. Correct. We no longer spend an hour in preparation. Even in the days of the Mishnah, this practice had fallen into disuse. Back in the days of the Mishnah, the hour preparation and the hour cool time, that's something they remembered from the pious rabbis of previous generations. But even the rabbis of the Mishnah were not on the level to be able to do that. Even the rabbis of the Mishnah, although 3 hours is tops, even they could not engage with the holy for a full 3 hours. Let's go one step further. I've been going in chronological order, beginning with the earlier sources and now coming down to the 19th century. I have an extract which I photographed from a Jewish newspaper. Not 19th century Jewish newspapers in general, but Jewish newspapers began in the 19th century. And in Eastern Europe, most of the Jewish newspapers were in Hebrew, some were in Yiddish. Let's see this letter that was written. Before we look at the letter, let me just point out who the author of the letter is. This is a letter which was written by Yitzchak Diskin. Yitzchak Diskin was one of the great rabbis of Lithuania, more famous for being one of the great rabbis of Yerushalayim, where he came to later in his life, but he was a canon. He was one of the great rabbis in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. Let's see this letter which he wrote to the editor. It's dated in Lomza. Lomza, big town. Well, I suppose it still is a big town, but back in those days, there were a lot of Jews in Lomza. It was a major center of yeshivas. Written on Kaf Gimel Elul. That is getting very close to Rosh Hashanah time. Very close to Rosh Hashanah, he sent in the following letter to the editor. Adoni, sir, hineni v'hatzia bazeh, I hereby recommend, lifnechem, to you plural, to all of you who read this letter, I hereby recommend to everyone who reads this letter, Dorshei Shalom Acheim Tovatam. I recommend that everyone pray for the Shalom amongst the Jews, and everyone pray for what is good. Ki lefidati, for in my opinion, Ulai haya nachon is perhaps correct. In my opinion, he expresses himself in a very modest way. It is perhaps correct, in my opinion. Well, no one told him he had to write the letter. No one told him he had to send it into the newspaper and get it published. This is his opinion, even though he hedges his formulation and expresses himself in a very modest way. It would seem to me that it makes sense, in my opinion. Well, this is what he says. La'orer et acheinu b'nei Yisrael, I must bring to the attention of all the Jews, b'chol mekamot mutvotehem, in all the places where they live, I must bring to the attention of all the Jews in all the Jewish communities. It's a few days before Rosh Hashanah. Livli ya'arifu b'tfilatam, that people, Jews, should please not spend a lot of time in prayer b'yom kesef, on the day when the moon is hidden. B'yom kesef, on the day when the moon is hidden. Hey, when the moon is hidden, yeah, everyone knows that the Jewish holidays, Sukkot, Pesach, everyone knows that Jewish holidays come on the middle of the month, the middle of the Jewish month, the middle of the lunar month, where there's a full moon. The one Jewish holiday which comes at the beginning of the month, where there's no moon at all, the moon is hidden, the moon is totally occluded, that's Rosh Hashanah. So the day when the moon is hidden, that's Rosh Hashanah, that's our Yom Tov, when the moon is not in the sky. Please, fellow Jews, do not lengthen your prayers on the day when the moon is going to be covered. In a few days, it's going to be Rosh Hashanah. Likratenu, that day of Rosh Hashanah is coming towards us. With Shalom, may it be an auspicious day. L'chol yoter ad chatzi hayom. No one should remain in the synagogue beyond midday. Midday is when the sun is directly overhead, right? Astronomical noontime. When the sun is directly overhead, that's exactly halfway between sunrise and sunset. Well, if you have a good calendar, it'll tell you the time of sunrise, the time of sunset, exactly in the middle is astronomical noontime. And please, he says, please don't remain in the synagogue in prayer beyond noontime. V'chol ha'am yishma'u v'yiru l'nafsham. Everyone should have fear for his soul. Everyone should listen to what I say and take care of his and her soul. V'yehi Hashem itanu l'shamreinu. God will then be with us, and God will protect us. M'kol tzara v'tzukah. God will then protect us from any evil or anything bad. V'yachadesh aleinu shana tova, and God will grant us a good new year. Me'uteret ka'avat nafsham. The new year will be crowned with everything that you can wish for. מכבודם מכיר פועלם, and you will be honored. Well, signed, Rav Yitzchak Diskin. So when we get down to the 19th century, we see at least one of the great rabbis haranguing the people not to daven too long in the synagogue. At this point, after having surveyed the attitudes of the rabbis to long prayers, at this point, I want to turn to what the poskim have to say. Poskim who define what the minimum requirements of prayer are. Let's see what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. Let's see what the great rabbis in their halachic works instruct us to do. The attitudes of the rabbis, well, we've been going through that since the beginning of the class. Now let's turn to the nitty-gritty bottom line conclusions of exactly what is obligatory and exactly what is not. Our first text is, of course, from the Shulchan Aruch. Since this is a halacha class, well, everyone knows that the Shulchan Aruch is the most important halachic source we have. So the words of the Shulchan Aruch are as follows, and once again, the siman number and paragraph number you have if you wish to look it up. And I hope I've typed it correctly. Mitzvat Yom Tov, the commandment of Yom Tov, doesn't matter what the Yom Tov is, Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, whatever the Yom Tov is, every Yom Tov has a mitzvah. Well, in many mitzvahs. One of the mitzvahs that applies to every Yom Tov, to every Chag, L'chalko, every Yom Tov should be divided, Chatzio, the Beit HaMidrash, half in the synagogue, V'chatzio la'achil u'shtiyah, and half for eating and drinking. That is, you have your spiritual endeavors on Yom Tov, and you have your physical endeavors on Yom Tov, and they must be balanced equally. Half of your time devoted to spiritual energy, prayer in the synagogue, learning Torah, spiritual activities, and an equal amount of time devoted to Oneg Yom Tov, devoted to physically enjoying the Yom Tov, eating and drinking. Well, if the synagogue services go on too long, that's going to impinge upon the other half of the Yom Tov, which is required, namely the Oneg part, the enjoyment part. The Oneg Yom Tov, enjoying Yom Tov is a mitzvah of the Torah after all, and v'samachta b'chagecha, it's an obligation of the Torah to eat and drink and enjoy yourself on Yom Tov, and according to the Shulchan Aruch, these two activities must be balanced in the sense that they occupy the same amount of time. And if you spend too much time in the synagogue, that's going to reduce the amount of time you can spend around the table with the family, or if you have friends invited, well, the eating and drinking, the oneg part of Yom Tov should be the same length as the spiritual exercise of Yom Tov, praying and learning Torah. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says. The Mishnah Brura, hard to point to a more influential, modern commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, modern, beginning of the 20th century. Beginning of the 20th century, not so long ago. Even you guys remember the 20th century. It's not so long ago, the 20th century. Well, most of you remember the 20th century. The Mishnah Brura writes as follows. These are the words of the Mishnah Brura. B'chad kro k'tiv, there's a verse which says, Atzeret tiyeh lechem, Yom Tov is for you. U'b'chad kro, there's another verse, k'tiv, where it is written, Atzeret l'Hashem Elokecha, Yom Tov is for God. two apparently contradictory verses. One says Yom Tov is for you, lachem. The other says Yom Tov is for Hashem, Lashem Elokecha. Therefore, the rabbis of the Talmud teach us, therefore, the Talmud reaches the conclusion very quickly that both of these verses must be correct, and the only way for both of the verses to be correct is if you divide your day equally between spiritual activities, Lashem Elokecha, and oneg, enjoying the Yom Tov, lachem, for you. Hainu l'Torah, l'tefillah, half for Torah, and tefillah, half for spiritual endeavors, chatzio lachem, half for you, namely eating and drinking for oneg Yom Tov. So the idea which the Shulchan Aruch requires is an idea which, not surprisingly, is embraced by the Acharonim, Mishnah Brura, early 20th century. Sure, hard to point to a more influential sefer than that. Let's go one step further. There we go. Shulchan Aruch was, of course, written towards the beginning of the 16th century. Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, he was born in Spain, and that was in the generation where the Jews were expelled from Spain. He made his way to Tzfat, I think everyone knows that, where the Shulchan Aruch was written. That's early 16th century. 100 years later, the 17th century, we begin to see the great commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch being published. The text we're about to read from is the Magen Avram. I don't know which is the single most important commentary written on the Shulchan Aruch, but the Magen Avram will be on anyone's short list of the most important commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. In every standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch, it's always printed in the outside margins of the Shulchan Aruch, the commentary of the Magen Avram. His name was Rav Avram Gambiner, Poland, 17th century. And once again, in the yeshiva world, that family name, Gambiner, is not well known. If you talk about the opinion of Rav Gambiner, most people will not have the vaguest idea who you're talking about. You have to call him the Magen Avram. Oh, the Magen Avram. That's a well-known sefer of immense influence. Now, before we look at his words, let me make a comment about the printing history of the Shulchan Aruch. So it's important to pay attention to where and when different Sforim were published. The first edition of the Shulchan Aruch was printed in Venice, which in those days was a major publishing center, and was 1625 plus or minus one. Was the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch in Eretz Yisrael in those days. And Rabbi Yosef Karo lived in Tzfat. There was no publishing in those days. There were no printing houses, no presses, and he had it printed in Venice, which was a major printing center. I remember once I was very concerned with establishing the correct text of a certain halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, in the laws of divorce. The commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch were of the opinion that the text of the Shulchan Aruch makes no sense at all, and one has to change the text, one has to correct the text. An error surely fell into the text. A printing error surely fell into the text of the Shulchan Aruch, was suggested by the commentaries. I found that interesting, and I was working in the Library of Congress in Washington, so I ordered a copy of the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch, the Venice edition, to see what the text had to say for the halacha that I was interested in. I got the sefer that I had ordered, and I first opened it up to the title page to make sure I was looking at the correct edition, that I really got the sefer I ordered, the first edition of the Shulchan Aruch, which is, of course, was without any commentaries, just pure Shulchan Aruch. Commentaries had not yet been written, obviously. And studying the title page to get the date and the place of publication to make sure I have the right edition in my hand, I could not help but notice that there's a decorative motif around the borders of the title page, a decorative motif showing images of women without any clothes on. And I thought to myself, my, oh my, what is going on here? Was this motif chosen because this volume of the Shulchan Aruch deals with marriage and divorce? I wondered. I ordered up the other 3 volumes of the other 3 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. They all had the same decorative motif on the title page, images of women without any clothes on. Of course, what happened in those days was we're talking about movable type, right? This is after Gutenberg. The movable type, the letters were set in type, were set by Jewish typesetters. You had to be a rabbinic scholar in order to be able to set the type correctly. But the title page, that was an artistic woodcut, and the artists who made the woodcut for the title page, they were not even Jewish. They were artists whose business it was to make decorative motifs for title pages. And as was quite typical in Venice in those days, the motif they chose was images of women without any clothes on. And remember, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author, was in Tzfat, in Eretz Yisrael. He, of course, had no way of personally supervising the publication of his work in Venice. He, of course, had no idea what was going on in Venice, I suppose, in my imagination. But when he eventually got a copy, he was unhappy with that, but there's nothing to be done about it. It was already done. In any event, a century later, we have the Magen Avraham Rav Gambiner writing what is, if not the most important, truly one of the most important commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. He writes now in the name of the Marashal. He's quoting the Marashal, Rav Shlomo Luria. Rav Shlomo Luria had lived almost 100 years earlier. Rav Shlomo Luria was the great rabbi in Eastern Europe who was at loggerheads, disagreed with the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, on a huge number of topics. Those 2 rabbis intellectually were engaged in argument over and over and over again, and they were both quite influential. In any event, the Marashal wrote as follows: Lo yimshach tefillah yoter mechatzot. Davening should never go beyond midday. Again, astronomical noontime, halfway between sunrise and sunset, when the sun is directly overhead. I said sun directly overhead, as though everyone is at the equator. But when the sun is halfway in the passage from east to west, that's astronomical noontime. And the Marashal said, no prayers should extend beyond that. And we understand the reasoning. We've seen all of the explanations and all of the reasons for this attitude. Masha ma'arichim chazanim b'nigunim, the chazanim who go to town on the melodies that they're singing, and it's the melodies which drag out the tefillah and make it longer and longer. Those long-winded chazanim, ein ze machatzio l'Hashem, the long-winded chazanim do not count as half of the Yom Tov, which is for you to enjoy eating and drinking or whatever it is you enjoy doing. It doesn't belong to the half for you, and doesn't belong to the half which belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The long-winded melodies which the Chazanim give us, dragging the tefillah be until after midday, that doesn't belong either belongs neither to the spiritual endeavors for Yom Tov, nor to the oneg of Yom Tov, and therefore is just wrong, wrong, wrong. Nothing wrong with nigunim as long as they're finished quickly. Quickly means not longer than chatzot, not longer than astronomical noontime. So at this point, we're going to pause. We've begun looking at what the early poskim have to say about length of davening. I'm going to pause now. Next time, we'll continue going chronologically and bring this down to contemporary times. Until then, I wish you a good week and eventually a good Shabbos, and look forward to seeing you all again next week at this time. Until then, shalom, shalom.